Well, hello and welcome back to Roundtable Mindset. This is Jamie.
And I'm Mahlon.
And we're back for another episode of Roundtable Mindset that, I don't know. Can we say it's back by popular demand? I do feel like we've gotten quite a bit of good feedback. So
I gotta say that this series that we're doing, Jamie, there's been a lot of people that have been appreciative. They've been reaching out, listening, really getting a lot of great content from Dr. Krista. So I would say, yes, we're back by popular demand and kind of maybe doing a small wrap up on this topic.
Well, yeah, because I think we kind of thought we were going to wrap up last week with Dr. Krista. That was a very long conversation that we edited into 2 pieces. And now we just felt like we had a few pieces that we kind of wanted to touch back on and ask some questions and bring back. So,
well, let's be clear. I'm being selfish. I love talking with Dr. Krista. So I'm like, let's bring her back just to talk. Can she just be here and sit in the corner? And when we need her, we'll just bring her forward and be like, what do you think, Dr. Krista? It was so much fun.
To be fair, we could find out if she's licensed in your state. I mean, maybe we could just, set that up, Mahlon, on a weekly basis or something. I don't know how that works, but I'm just kidding. But so yeah, we're going to bring back Dr. Krista to join us today, just to kind of talk about, wrap up that conversation about narcissism and how that affects us and what that looks like. And so we have with us again, Dr. Krista. Are you there?
Definitely. And I do appreciate that this has been a helpful podcast and that people are tuning in, because it is a hot topic, but more importantly, it's a topic that we can grow and learn from, and not to label people or to point fingers, but to help understand and recognize how this impacts relationships and empower us to have the knowledge to maybe impact change for ourselves, not necessarily just draw labels and start trying to diagnose people.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm going to go ahead and second that, because we were talking a little bit before we actually turned the mics on, and I thought it was such a good point. I want to kind of bring it in here. One of the things that this conversation has done, and I'll also say some of our listeners that are coming in, it's sounding like having just the knowledge and just being like, hey, I'm not alone, or somebody understands what I'm going through, or even getting information that says, this is something that I can start doing for myself, gives them a sense of empowerment. It did it for me. It did it for my wife. It sounds like it's doing it for our listeners. And so, that by itself, a huge thank you. But what an impactful conversation to have. And I'll speak for myself. There's been a lot of times where you are dealing with this individual and you're just like, it's almost hopeless. It's like, I can't change anything. What am I supposed to do? So you just kind of throw up your hands, and either you succumb to this is my life now, or you run away and you avoid the relationship altogether. This gives you almost, at least it did for me, almost a third avenue, which is, wait a minute, there are things that I can do. There are things that I can watch for. There are things that, it's okay for me to set up a boundary. It's okay for me not to only just say I have a boundary, but then reinforce it. And I think all of that is really, really powerful and been really helpful.
Yeah, I think, well, and even I can tell you in my experience and through my training, being able to label something, having language to describe, because I think you go through this in this internal struggle, you don't necessarily know what to call it, and I think when you don't have if you don't have words to use to describe it, sometimes it makes it seem like it's me, like I'm the problem, right? And so this person is acting this way because there's something wrong with me, because I didn't behave the way I should, or I didn't, perform the way I should. And by having that label, I know in my own life that has been huge, because then I can take that blame off of myself, look at what I could do differently, but then understand that that is their problem, not mine. And that helps me be okay too. So I do think that just the language piece is huge. Just having words to describe it can be hugely healing, I think.
I would agree, and I'd agree with that. Like, that can be generalized to many of the things that are mental health or even health related. If we have the language, we can understand and we can communicate. And then we can also that helps facilitate the not feeling alone and being able to educate ourselves and talk with others about it. I would echo that for sure. I think the other key piece that was alluded to is not feeling alone. If we have common language, we can not feel alone, as well as we can have those discussions that otherwise we might be too fearful of having.
Yeah, that's true too. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and again, I think there's so much more we can apply that everything we've learned, and I know we've been focusing really on like narcissistic traits and relationships, but just to maybe put a final button into just the narcissist piece of our conversation, I did have one other question, Dr. Krista, that I would love to just pick your brain on. And some of the feedback that has come in from some of our listeners, I kind of hear the same tone in there. And I'm going to use my words because I struggled with this with my mother-in-law's relationship. And that is, you try to give somebody, especially in my Christian faith and belief, we try to give people the, assume no, wrong intent, or, they're not trying to hurt us. They're people too, just like I am. Like, you try to give them grace, you try to give them love, you try to give them respect, all the things. And time again, it just seems like this person just keeps going back to the same poisoned well and treating you or mistreating you, and things sometimes escalate. So one question that I'd like to ask you to see if you have an opinion, or you can kind of maybe help guide the conversation for just a minute, is, when we're dealing with someone who we think or we know is a narcissist, and sometimes they're not even aware of how they're treating us, that's kind of a big pill or a bitter pill to swallow. And so I'm just curious, can you kind of help guide or give some of your expertise around, help me understand how can that happen? Because every single time that I've treated somebody or even mistreated someone, I was aware of what I was doing. And sometimes I did it on purpose, and sometimes I didn't do it on purpose. But when I didn't do it on purpose, I'd always go back and try to make amends with somebody. And so when I hear things like, sometimes a narcissist doesn't understand or doesn't realize how they're treating someone, it really falls on deaf ears because of all the years of being mistreated and being abused by this individual. So I just need a little bit of help, I think, to get over that. If you have any words of wisdom that you could give us.
Well, I'm going to start with an analogy, kind of, and hopefully I won't get either too off track or too confusing. But if we conceptualize the individual who has a narcissistic characteristics as someone who has an intrinsic wound, they are internally wounded to the point that the two dichotomies potentially are they have forever been entitled, and so they think that they deserve, and people just need to listen to them. And so they may have that viewpoint so strongly ingrained that when they don't get that that they aren't having all that importance, and what they say isn't gospel to everybody. Or the other extreme that I alluded to last time was that they've had a narcissistic wound, like they've been so harmed and mistreated that they are defensive, and they have to be in control of stuff, and they have to present themselves as excellent and great, and they have to do these things that it becomes their survival mode in order to be okay. But inside they really have this narcissistic wound, and it presents itself in the manners that we've talked about previously. So if you think of if somebody is throwing a ball at your face, your natural reaction automatically is to save your face, right? Your arms are going to go up, your hands are preparing, the whole fight or flight. Internally, they initially had the response as a survival technique. Somebody is threatening who I am because they have this major wound that's already there. They already hate themselves, or they think they're not good enough from this pain. And so their reactivity is to have to show everybody how awesome they are. And then they start to try to control things. They mistreat people, but they don't have any insight about it. And then it becomes, after time, it becomes reactionary. It becomes a habit. It's a reflex. And so they don't have insight to it. It's just automatically there. And they may not have the skills to reflect back on it, and oftentimes don't, which is similar to virtually one of the characteristics of any diagnosable clinical personality disorder is people lack insight about it, and they really don't get it. And so they don't seek treatment. They don't attempt to change it unless they have discomfort with it, which is why sometimes narcissistics do, because they have legal problems or relational problems that they really don't want to lose, and they're forced into a setting of treatment. The other situation where individuals maybe were consistently entitled, their reactivity becomes like, I have to protect myself because how dare this person, how I know I'm awesome. How dare this person even question that? Because nobody does. I've always been the best thing since sliced bread. And so their protection is like, how dare they? And it becomes habit also. And so again, they have that reaction. It's like a reflex. It becomes ingrained in their personality, their typical way of viewing the world, thinking, feeling, and behaving. And so it's just natural for them, just as if our reflexes occur in a physical situation. Does that make sense? Again, not promoting or saying it's okay, but it can help us to conceptualize why they may not have insight into it. And only if it's painful enough might they be motivated to even look or introspect. But at the same time, what if they introspect in what they always believed to be true because of their entitled past, or what they always believed to be true because they were so mistreated? What if that truly is the case when they're challenged? Because they might die. And I know that sounds dramatic, but their internal experience without awareness is, what if I die? Because I'm being challenged at the core level.
Yeah, and what's hard, I guess, is it's almost like speaking about a narcissistic relationship. Even in my experience where I was telling that individual, this is harmful, you're hurting us, this is not healthy, it was almost met with just, you're lying. What you're telling me is a lie because it cannot be true. And it came across a lot of times as just a complete disregard of how their actions were impacting us physically, mentally, emotionally, however it was. And I think it was just that blatant disregard that is hard for me, even after everything we've talked about and hearing you now. It's hard to take the past conversations and that truth and put them together and say they both can live in the same space, because it's almost like one has to be true or the other. They can't both coexist. And kind of what I'm hearing you say is there's an element of they do exist. And that's hard for me to wrap my brain around, if I can be honest.
Totally agree. Difficult. And that's why we would describe it as a mental illness. And we're hopeful that we can't relate too much to that lack of insight, because that is a level of the element of mental health sometimes, especially with personality disorders. It's part of that really being beyond what a healthy human being could really comprehend and understand. Mm-hmm. And so it is in some ways very uncomprehendable. And what you described, you're not alone. I mean, the majority of people who have family members or loved ones or have even beginning to develop a relationship are like, wow, this is crazy. How could this even be? Or a person puts on, they know their social prowess and they're smart and they're able to get into relationships, but then they can't sustain it because of those other really unknown or hidden characteristics that threaten who they really are. Don't want people to really get to know me. And then they manipulate the people around them that are already stuck. So there is a component of manipulation within that, without a doubt. But they also do not really have the insight to be able to challenge themselves because of what they might see.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for me, I don't know, hindsight's 2020, right? I mean, when you can go back and look, I remember there being like spaces where I almost had to, I mean, there was a large chunk of time that I did not speak with my mom because of, I don't think she was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. There were lots of other diagnoses, but that was not one of them. But it just became so toxic and unhealthy. And a real lack of respect for those boundaries, I think, was it. But it was almost like I had to poke around to see, like, if I do this, will that help? If I do this, will that help? And maybe I can do that. Like, I changed my boundaries to try and fit around that. And when I finally came to a conclusion that it didn't matter what I did, there was nothing I could do to improve the situation. I had done everything that I could to make it better. And then I had to make that decision, right? Like I had to just come to an acceptance that I've done what I can. This person is going to do what this person is going to do. And the only thing I can do is decide how I'm going to respond to that. And that took a long time. And I think that's where some of these kind of injuries come from, where you're like, okay, but I've said this and I've done this and I've tried to express this over and over and over again, and they just can't hear it. I will say that though, I don't even remember how many years that was. And all of the pressure that I got from extended family and all of the people around us that were like, Jamie, you need to build that bridge. She's your mom and all of these things. And it wasn't until at some point she had softened those boundaries for me to say, nope, I can respect that. I can do that. It was like, it wasn't until there was some movement from her to accept that this was a hard line for me, before we were able to start building some of that relationship back. So I do think, I don't know, and we've talked about this before, Mahlon, this idea of radical acceptance, like, right? Like as family members to people that really struggle with this, I feel like we do have to come to some sort of radical acceptance about what's happening, and our ability to influence a situation is super limited. And we have to decide how we're going to respond to keep ourselves healthy moving into future interactions with them,
I do. And I don't know why I'm going to say this next statement, although it's just what my brain's going through. We spend a lot of time in the land of the narcissistic environment in the last couple episodes. And some of the things in my research and even in our conversation makes me want to start looking out around toxic relationships as a whole. And so I'm curious, even what you said, Jamie, I'm not arguing. I think, yes, we've had these conversations, but it does make me want to start asking, is that always like, I'm going to ask a really dumb question, but I'm going to say it because I think this is where I really would struggle. Is it really a one size fits all to every type of toxic relationship, right? So if this is how a narcissistic relationship is going on, that radical acceptance or everything we've talked about, is it like a rinse and repeat for all toxic relationships? Or is this just one area, and every relationship, there's a different style or method to deal with? Does that make sense? I feel like I'm rambling.
I think it makes lots of sense. And what I heard you say is like, we know there's toxic relationships, and we've, through our discussion, recognized that individuals who have narcissistic features, or if they're diagnosable or whatever, those features are going to be destructive, or would definitely fit in that category broadly of promoting toxicity in a relationship or developing a toxic relationship. But there are also other characteristics. Oftentimes they're going to be personality related characteristics, because those are enduring patterns where one or more of the partners don't get it. They don't have awareness or insight about what their personality characteristics are doing. So say it was someone with borderline personality disorder. Again, roughly tumultuous relationships, high emotionality, a flair for drama, oftentimes self-harm, but not always, without intent to kill themselves. Situations where they are splitting, where they have opposite extremes of like, I really like something or I really hate something, and it could flip from 1 minute to the next. Quick overview of some of the characteristics of borderline personality disorder. So a person who is starting a relationship with this person that has these borderline personality characteristics, similar dynamic. It's going to be toxic, but it's not going to present itself with the same characteristics that the narcissistic personality is. Some of those are present also, but they might be someone who instead, like, they'll just flip from really liking you to the next time not liking you at all, or thinking. There's like some borderline thinking sometimes of like changing the narrative to what they believe it to be, which is somewhat similar to narcissism. Sometimes there can be elements of like, if you leave me, I'm going to hurt myself, where you're not necessarily going to get that from the narcissist always. I mean, there's some overlap, but so in general, there's going to be personality characteristics that can help to lead to this toxicity, but it might be different from different personalities. So dependency, someone who's highly dependent, they have difficulty making decisions. They hesitate. They're kind of like a doormat, and they're passive. They don't communicate. They put up with things, and maybe they even ultimately blow up, but they just depend on everybody else. If you're in a relationship, that can become very toxic, but it's going to look much different than someone who is narcissistic in that relationship. Does that help to kind of address a little bit of what you're saying?
Yeah. And that's kind of where, as we were talking, I was like, okay, so I've been focused on this one toxic, I would say narcissistic relationship. But if you start picking your head up a little bit and looking across the land of other just regular, I mean, or normal relationships can sometimes turn toxic, right? And so when I'm hearing this, I was like, wait a minute, but are we just discussing right now the red flags for every toxic relationship and this is how you handle it? That seemed too not to fit either. But yeah, it made me ask the question, like, well, what do we do? And is it a one size fits all? And there's a variety of different relationships out there, and I can't imagine they're all the same.
Well, and don't you think too, I guess, like, I mean, I'm a divorced person, right? I don't think I could say that my spouse has any of those things, but there were definitely pieces of his personality that weren't a good match, right? It was toxic for me in that relationship because it wasn't a good fit. And so it's almost like I think all of these things exist, and I don't know that I've ever focused a ton on these things outside of that relationship with my mom. Like, really understanding some of those dynamics was important for me at that time. But it's almost like we're going to encounter these situations with people who have toxic personality traits that aren't diagnosable because they have a toxic personality trait that might work well for someone else. But what do we do for ourselves, right? Like, how does that fit with us, and how do we deal with that when we encounter it? I think that's if we can be more intentional about that and understanding that about ourselves, I feel like that would lead to much more healthy interactions for me moving forward. How do I be intentional about that?
Excellent. And I think in terms of those situations, life happens, right? And it's fluid. So it could be two fairly healthy people, but they're both in current circumstances or situations that lend themselves to not being the best version of themselves at the time. So it leads to a toxic relationship where it could be all situational that both people are experiencing, or at any given time that one person is experiencing at the time when their relationship begins or as it continues. So even in a healthy relationship, life happens, and certain circumstances could promote that toxicity. And depending on other many, many factors, of course, it could influence whether they're able to work through that toxic piece of their relationship or not. Sometimes that's personality, and sometimes it's highly situational. I think that's a really good point. To go to your kind of the thesis of your question is like, what are some substantial things we can do about this? When I was hearing you talk about some of the life events that you've gone through, Jamie, I think it is a partially that giving grace, is partially that brutal acceptance or total acceptance that you referred to. But I think it's also a lot about not being responsible for others' emotions and feelings in relationships. So like if I look at a behavior or mom A is acting in a certain way, and I am concerned about keeping the peace with this person, I'm concerned about hurting their feelings, I'm concerned about hurting my spouse's feelings or my children, how that's going to influence my children, and I'm worried about the feelings, then I may react in ways that are less than helpful. If I can recognize that this is this person, this is a way that I believe I need to be treated, this is a way that I want my family to be treated, fill in the blanks, right? So I'm going to focus on the behavior rather than my role in managing their emotions. I'm only responsible for my behaviors and my feelings. I'm not responsible for their feelings. And so it's hard to do. It is exceptionally hard to do when you love somebody and you want your wife to be happy or your significant other, or, you know, for me, honestly, when there's been times in my life that there's been family members that maybe present some characteristics that are toxic or not helpful, the end game is like, I can figure this out, and I can live with some unhealthy things. I can try to recognize when I'm going from my emotionality rather than the behavior and what is healthy. And then I can set the limits and boundaries I know are helpful. But when it came to my kids, I can see the behaviors. It's not okay. And I can set those boundaries and I can be okay with it. And I can separate my feelings and emotions and recognize theirs. And then I can set boundaries and stuff. When it comes to me, however, it's like, so much of the time it's like, I can deal with this, but I'm not going to put up with that with my kids because I want to be a healthy role model. I want them to develop healthy skills, etc. Make sense?
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. Because that I think is probably one of the barriers that I experienced as coming when we were coming out of that like no contact space. Because I think emotionally I wanted all of those things that I expected from my mom, that I felt I deserved from my mom. I expected those things and I hoped for those things, but those weren't going to happen, right? And so like emotionally it was harder for me to come back to that space where we could have contact because I never got those things. I didn't get an apology for those things. So my feelings were still hurt, but the behaviors were able to shift. You know what I mean? And so I think that did get really muddled in my mind when I was coming back to that space, because I still like, don't you want to make this right with me? Because my feelings are still here, right? So I think that is such a good wow. I wish I had that information when I was parenting. That probably would also been very helpful, like
Glad to hear. And I think so. The core is, because I can get all muddly, right, or muddy, is when you can recognize the behaviors that are unhealthy and not try to go by only your emotions, or don't go to a well where there's no water.
yeah, yeah,
Once we can accept that I am not going to get what I want from this relationship due to X, Y, and Z, and I can focus on the behaviors and be okay with what I get from the relationship, and am I okay with it, it's going to help promote us being able to return to that relationship and be healthier in that relationship. But also, we can also choose to take care of ourselves and just not engage in that relationship totally, or engage only when the behaviors are supportive of what we need from that relationship. And we get to be not really in control of it, but we get to be in control of our lives, and we don't let the emotions drag us through an empty, dry pool of muck.
right, right. There was a radio program that I used to listen to, and she used to say, "You can't expect an alligator to sit in your lap and purr." And I think it wasn't until I was able to accept that point exactly that I was able to even have, because it wasn't about repairing what had happened before. It really was about how do we move forward in this relationship in a healthy way. And I almost had to accept what happened. What I wanted and what I hoped for and what I expected was not going to happen. So what can this look like moving forward? It was like a really big shift. Once I could accept that I couldn't expect her to sit in my lap and purr, that wasn't what was going to happen, right? So that's really good insight. And I guess, Malin, to go back to your question, I feel like those were the pieces that helped me understand that she was never going to apologize for what had happened, because she couldn't see that there was something wrong with what happened. And I'm convinced, even to the day she passed away, I cut her off because I had a problem. You know what I mean? Like, it was me that had the problem, and I came back and she was willing to accommodate me. I'm positive that lens was very different for her than it was for me in that space.
Well, and all of this is really insightful and wonderful. It really is. And, Jamie, I try to relate this back to me so I can have something to ground myself into. And, fortunately, I've never had a relationship like I had with my mother-in-law. Like, I've had difficult relationships, but nothing I couldn't handle. And when both of you were talking, the one thing that I wanted to unmute myself. In fact, I did a couple times, and I wanted to jump in and say, yeah, but what about this? And I think where that comes from is, in order for me to be successful, and I'm going to say not just me as in Mahlon, but me as in my personality type, which I think other people have, in order for me to be successful in that relationship that either I felt like I had to be in because of my family dynamic, married into the family, I can't just pretend like she doesn't exist. It's hard for me to recognize the well is dry when I can say, but I can fill it back up. It's dry now, but I can fix it. I'll just dump more water into it. And when it drains back out and it's dry again, I'll just do it again and again and again. And I think for me, what I had to realize was I'm tired of doing that. I'm tired of investing my days, my energy into filling up something that doesn't hold water or doesn't give me back water. And so I agree with everything, but I think the one element that I just want to kind of pull out there is I have to believe there's other people with my personality type that they struggle because you want to fix it. In order to be successful, you have to fix the problem. And if you can't fix it, even if it's not your problem to fix, it's hard to realize and it's hard to overcome that.
Sorry, I was just thinking about our conversation the other day, Mahlon, about circles of control. And, just, that was another tool that was hugely helpful for me to realize, like, I can't control that situation. And so it just made me think back to the other day when we were chatting about that. But what can you control? And that person is not one of them.
Right. And also the notion of how can I be okay in this relationship when I am very limited? I think one of the things that happens when we have someone that is, quote unquote, supposed to have certain characteristics, like a mom that's supposed to be nurturing, or a dad, or fill in the blank, whatever that person, our perceptions of what that role should be, especially when it comes to like nurturing or just having healthy boundaries and healthy relationships and being predictable in a social situation, etc. Our perceptions play a role in that. And so I think it's awesome, Mahlon. You're not a saint. None of us are, right? But I think the more unrelatable it is to the unhealthy behaviors of, say, narcissism or certain behaviors that are so toxic to a relationship. But I'm going to focus on narcissism because I don't know you well enough to know any of the others. But within the things that we talked about with narcissism, I think that's awesome because you don't have the emotional pull to want to fix it. And you want your wife's life to be better. But you have a different level of not like, it's unrelatable. It's not to your core of being mistreated by your mom to the point that, say, Jamie's described she can relate to. Not necessarily mistreated, but not getting the nurturing that you would hope, that you, like the mom that Jamie, say, wanted to be, right? And so if you can't relate to that, I think that's a great sign. I don't want my kids to be able to relate to and understand the people in their lives that are narcissistic, even now, family members, because I hope that they don't really understand it, but they can be aware of the signs. And so, like, going back to your thoughts, some of those signs could be if someone is making us feel crazy, like maybe they switch their story up, or one moment they are saying things that are totally contradictory to other people that we trust in our world, then that would be a sign that, oh, this might be kind of toxic. This might be about them, not about me. Of course, people who are vulnerable are much more likely to be a potential target to someone who has, say, toxic characteristics, whether that's narcissism or dependency or other characteristics that are less than helpful or create toxicity in a relationship. So if you start feeling crazy or you're hearing different information from that person that all the other feedback in your life, that might be a clear sign. If the boundaries are just non-existent or shift up to their favor only, or they can't accept the boundaries that you put on them that seem very healthy to you, and especially if you've had experience and you know that they're healthy relationships, or you've read, again, if you're narcissistic and you don't have any insight, you might be thinking these are healthy boundaries, but you're clueless. So again, it gets complicated, right? But again, when boundaries get broken consistently, or boundaries are created that are really not acceptable, you have a role in your life in what those boundaries would look like. Also, if you have other people, it's kind of tied to that. If you have other people in your life that you see as healthy or appear to be pretty healthy, and you start getting them questioning, like, is this somebody are you really dating this person? I know this, and this, but, or will you continue to share with me what happens in your relationship? Because I love you. And this has sounded really not okay. Trust those people that you know are healthy or have been there for you or are healthy in your life if they're starting to have doubts about a relationship, or with that on maybe the beginning, hopefully, of the relationship, or if things shift in a relationship. Trust them, or at least explore them and listen to them. But those might be some basic signs. Of course, in general, in toxic relationships, to use a couple of things that Mahlon talked about, devaluation. If you're feeling very devalued, there might be some signs that this is not such a healthy relationship. However, if it's accurate devaluation, like, oh, you really stink at cooking eggs, and it's accurate, we still need to have enough insight to look at that, and we need to be challenged in order to grow, right? But like, or emotional abuse, like, oh, that was a really dumb move, consistently, or name calling or blaming when it's not in fun, it's not really in jest, or it's hurtful. even if it's meant in those ways, it doesn't mean it's okay. So those might be some signs or some ideas of maybe to recognize some toxicity in relationships.
Yeah, and you actually, there's so much there that I'm like, yeah, one thing I want to circle back around to, because I don't think, Jamie, I'm going back in our last couple episodes, even from the very first season, I think we've always talked about boundaries. I think we've talked around that topic, but I don't know if we've actually came out and discussed boundaries. And so one thing that keeps coming to mind, Dr. Krista, is in the relationships that I would label as, toxic, or in this case, it was that narcissistic relationship. The boundary piece is where I would say the relationship started feeling the squeeze, right? Like that's where really, I mean, you want to hit that hornet's nest, you put up a good boundary and like try to reinforce it. And I will say the individuals that I know of that have kind of what I would label as a toxic relationship, they almost make you feel bad about that boundary. Like you did something wrong by putting up something to protect yourself or your family members. And so for a while it worked. And so I don't know if you have any extra insights or any words of wisdom that you can give us around how do you, I think there's 2 steps to boundaries. This is my layman's terms. Like there's one to establish a boundary, which then people know, hey, there's a boundary here you cannot cross. I will not allow you to cross this any line longer. And I think the other piece, and this is where I struggle because of, my mother-in-law making me feel guilty about it, or, pressuring you from outside the relationship, being like, I can't believe you would do that to her. Like, that's just so rude, is reinforcing that boundary. And for the longest time, we established boundaries, but we never reinforced them. And the consequences, it almost kind of sounds like a parenting technique when I'm talking out loud. It's like, we're going to say, you can't do X, Y, and Z. And if you do X, Y, and Z, here's your consequence. And what was weird for me as I'm doing retrospective review here now is that it's almost a form of disciplining, like I would my child, to a person who is either my equal or supposed to be my senior. And that's a very weird dynamic. So I know I talked a lot about that really in this minute that I had the mic, but I will say those are some of the areas that I struggled in. And so, Dr. Krista, do you have any insights around that? Or Jamie, do you have any, experience you can pull in there? Because those were if I had to look back, those were the 2 areas that we struggled.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know, for me, and this is something I've had to grow in. Like setting boundaries and respecting boundaries it's hard, especially if you don't have someone who's intentionally teaching you how to do that, right? Like if it's not a dynamic that's healthy in your family as you're growing up, you don't know how to do it. And so I think one of the best clinicians that I've worked with kind of describe boundaries. It's not like a brick wall. It has to be kind of rubber, right? Like a little bit like a rubber band. And there are people in my life that I can release those boundaries a little bit with, and that I can bend and expect them to bend a little bit to me too. I think it's for me, it's been when it's constant, right? Like if I'm constantly being expected to abandon that boundary or that space, that has been the hardest spaces. And it does feel like parenting. And thankfully, I learned enough about this before my kids got older that I was able to use those language pieces alone. Just like, hey, no, we're setting a boundary here. Like this is a firm boundary. But I do think that it feels yucky. Anytime you have to set a firm boundary because someone isn't respecting that space, it feels really yucky. But I do think the more, something I tell my kids all the time is, if you don't respect your own boundaries, they're not going to respect them either. Right. And so, I have to really be intentional about when I accept a bend in my boundaries, because that then lays the groundwork. I think when you're talking about people in this space specifically, those are people who are used to people bending their boundaries for them because they push so hard. They're the loudest, they're the biggest, they're the the strongest. And if you don't bend the boundaries, they just get bigger, louder, and stronger, right? Like, so I think these spaces get even harder because you don't have an option in their mind but to change your boundaries. So it makes it even worse, I think. I can't imagine. No, I can. Sorry, I just lied. I can imagine exactly what it feels like to grow up in a household with someone who isn't able to teach you about boundaries, because that was a very difficult thing with my mom, given her mental health challenges that she had. We didn't have this conversation. I knew exactly where those lines sat with my dad, but it was a whole different story. You know what I mean? Like, it was just, and I don't know that I don't know that I can speak a ton to this. I don't know that he was able to keep those firm boundaries with my mom all the time either. You know what I mean? So it's like, you just don't have that basis to come from. Yeah, I don't know if that answers any of your question, but those were the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about that. It is a hard thing, especially as the child of someone who experiences this. That can be a really difficult space to be in.
Well, and not to feel like I'm challenging that, Jamie. I came from a household who were taught very well about boundaries. So,
Yes, you
I mean,
were.
it's so funny. Well, no, it's so funny. You know my parents. I mean, you met my mom.
Yeah.
You want to talk about somebody who literally would put up a physical boundary. I mean, she was an expert at it, and she didn't pull any punches. You crossed it. This is your consequence. I told you, move on. And so it wasn't even a matter of, like, I love what you said, because it's almost like both of us have two sides of the coin. And even when we put those together, there's still discussions and issues with people, setting those boundaries yourself, or how do you reinforce the consequences of those boundaries? And one element that when you were saying, Jamie, that hit my ear was, I know how to set boundaries. I was taught how to set boundaries. The one area that I wasn't talked about, and I think it's just implied, is when is it okay for me to set up a boundary? Because sometimes those scenarios look different. And I think that's what happened with my mother-in-law, is I wasn't expecting to have to set up a boundary, because this is what my mother was like. Therefore, this is what my mother-in-law is going to be like. And when she didn't fit that mold, I was almost left like, well, can't I? What does that look like? And one other thing, and then Dr. Krista, I would love to hear from you, is my mother-in-law got more and more animated when the boundary was in place. So things got really crazy. So to your point, these are the people that they don't like to be told what to do, or the boundary's not there. I can understand that 100%, because when things got crazy is when there was a boundary in play. So there was times we're like, should we just abandon it? Like, just forget it, because this is causing more harm than good. And when we finally got to the point where we're like, no, we don't care anymore. Like, this is it. This is what it's supposed to be, regardless of how the other person feels. It was almost like it grew to a crescendo. And then once we got over that mountain, then it started settling down. And guess what? Our boundary was in place. And that was a long lesson for us to learn.
Two experts, honestly. I mean, this is when you have lived experience on either end, because Jamie described right before you talked, Mahlon, of the exact converse of what you described. And so she didn't have direction of knowing or model of that. And so she struggled with it. And you struggle with knowing, oh, I have to create these boundaries, because there's a norm that people do, that mothers do, that, that unfortunately isn't typical for everyone. A couple of thoughts that I have, going back to even the original point, is with boundaries, I think I like the idiom of give an inch, take a mile. So when we're dealing with toxic people in relationships, and you said it just in different words, Jamie, is like you have to know who you're dealing with, whether you can budge a bit, because it's like that teenager. One teenager I might be able to say, you know what, that kind of makes sense. We can do this. And the other teenager I may like, this is what it is. You know that, buddy. And so we have to know who, what, when, how we're dealing with it, and also what the behaviors or circumstances are, right? So I think that whole, it definitely is a give and take, but when we're dealing with personality disorders or those kinds of characteristics that really promote toxicity in relationships, that might be us being manipulative and ahead of the game, knowing like, I'm working with so-and-so, so I'm going to ask for 300 dollars when I only want 200 or 50. Or so we're going to set a boundary much different than because we need to negotiate it with, because we know what personality we're dealing with. So if the situation is I'm going to set a boundary with stepmom or grandma or whomever that I know has issues with that, I might start with something really high and then I give her control. So I become the manipulator of the manipulator who has the issues. Does that make sense?
I was going to say, Mahlon, she's singing your song right now.
That is my love language. But no, just kidding. But
unhealthy.
No, I'm kidding. But what you just said there, I wish I would have had that. Like Jamie said this earlier, I'm going to say it now. I wish I would have had that insight 20 years ago, honestly, because that is a life lesson that you can learn. I'm here to prove that you can learn that, but I have a lot of bumps and bruises to show how long it took me to figure that out. When if I could have just had that as a starting off point 20 years ago, I think it would have made a huge impact in my relationship with my mother-in-law, to be honest.
And I think that's somewhat of a discussion point towards, like, even in very healthy families, which is what you've described. I mean, boundaries, maybe it was to a flaw, I don't know. But when there's healthy boundaries and stuff, I think we want to kind of expose people. We want to expose our kids to those situations where, like, they have friends over. You didn't have the insight, because I only have the insight primarily because I have some lived experience and I have education of almost 40 years now of people's life experiences and growing with them and having them figure out what works for them, as well as me growing every single day vicariously through our work together, as well as the educational piece, which, that's a lot good, a lot not so helpful sometimes, the educational stuff. But by and large, that's where we have our foundation, our basis to grow from. So when you're describing your situation, even in those healthy life circumstances, if we have the knowledge, like now, people listen to the podcast, hopefully they have a little greater insight. So even if they're in healthy relationships with partners or raising kids, they can say, oh, I need to, when my kids are exposed to this, or when this dynamic is happening, I want to teach about this would be what a toxic relationship looks like. This was a boundary violation. This is a situation where, or even retrospectively, I'll go back with my kids and we'll, in those discussions, going like, remember when this happened? This is why we did that, and then they can then pass that on. Or we have very transparent discussions about unhealthy members of our family, extended family, etc. And in those discussions, we're very transparent, and we have let our kids from a very young age. You can love somebody, you don't have to love their behavior. That separation.
Sorry, I was going to say, have you done the conversations with your kids where you go back and you say, this is what I wish I would have done? Because those are super helpful for my kids too. I've noticed over the last, I don't know, probably 6 months, they're both asking all kinds of interesting questions. And yes. This is how I wish I'd responded to that, or this is how I wish I would have behaved, or however. Those conversations have been super helpful for my kids. And I think that helps. Reinforce the lessons that I hope that they learn moving forward, or continue with moving forward in setting boundaries, what they accept for themselves as healthy and appropriate, and all of those things has been, I do think that's a good tool.
Definitely from that direction as well. And it also allows opportunity to model, to be humble, to apologize. And I tell you what, I make mistakes on purpose sometimes, even with my students, so that I can apologize. Because when we can be human with our kids, with important people in our lives, whatever our status is, and we can overcome that, we can grow and get tighter. We can let ourselves be vulnerable, and then we can come stronger from that. Oh my gosh. There's times I don't have to create the mistakes. Sometimes I just humbly accept it, like we all do. But when we can do that with individuals, we have to, again, recognize those individuals who might take advantage of it, who already have demonstrated inappropriate or unhelpful boundaries, or taking opportunities to use our vulnerabilities against us. And so we have to be cautious in that. And that's where we learn from it when we make mistakes with that. But we also have initial awareness, which is why you all are doing this podcast. And I honor you for doing that. I think it is helpful because regardless of the space that we're currently in, we can either retrospectively grow in the moment, or we can stop and pause and make different decisions down the road. So that general thing of like separating, or mantra of separating the behavior from the person, I think is huge. The other thing is, Mahlon, guess what? Your mother-in-law can't make you feel anything. When she makes you feel guilty was the statement. So I'm kind of goofing around with you, but reality is that's part of the dynamic, is keeping those emotions separate from, and knowing that I feel guilty because I want her to be happy. I want things to be better in our relationship. And as you've grown, you've in that relationship and had to set those boundaries and be firm in it. And like you said, kind of grow. And now those boundaries at the end of the day are there. Still think that part of that is letting go of them giving control of our emotions, or us trying to manage their emotions.
Yeah, and you said something there that at the end, that's really, as I'm going to say this next statement, it still hurts sometimes to say it, because I don't normally think in these terms, I guess. But one of the things that I had to come to terms with is exactly what you said. I was in pain. I was annoyed. I was angry, because not what my mother-in-law was doing, her actions, because again, she's an adult, right? What she chooses to do with her life and her relationships has no bearing on me. Now, the ones that affect my family, I was making the life that I should have had, and I think you've said this in one of the episodes, is the mother-in-law that I should have had, my father-in-law that I should have had, this is how life was supposed to go. And I'm mad because you're not giving that to me. You're robbing me. You're robbing my children. You're robbing my wife of all of this. And so I was more angry at the fact of things that I had lost or would never have than I was so much around that action itself. I mean, don't get me wrong. The action still hurts. The action still is annoying. The action is still, at the moment, yeah, I'm angry. But when I did take a step back and some time passed and we kind of had that separation from that side of the family, I really did start understanding that the reason I was the most mad is because of the things that we lost that we'll never get back. I mean, even now, if I sit here and I'm truly honest, there's been a few years now where there's been no contact, and that's also makes me mad and sad and frustrated and irritated, because look at all the time that we lost. The really weird flip side to that, though, is in its current state, there's nothing to have, right? Like, if there's no change from this individual, I'm mourning a thought. I'm angry about a thought, because in reality, we would never get those things anyways. And I think once we kind of sat down and really put those two pieces together, I can let a lot of stuff go. I still hold on to some anger. I still hold on to some resentment, and I'm working through that. But the majority of it, to your point, was I was more mad of things I've lost or will never have than I was actually around the situations that were happening. And that, again, tough pill to even say out loud right now. That really is something I've had to learn over the years and come to grips with.
It's funny you say that, because I think that was a piece of, and I don't know that I recognized it at the time, but looking backwards, I really had to go through the whole grief process a couple of times before I was able to go back, because that was how I was able to put it to bed and say, what happened, happened. I can't expect anything different moving forward. We're just going to look forward and see what we can build new, because what was there isn't healthy, and I don't want to go back to that space. I had to really go through that grief process, and it's funny how often I have had to grieve things and haven't realized that I was doing that until later, right? And I think that that's a big piece of the process. I don't know that I could have gone back in any sort of healthy way had I not gone through some of those grief pieces, the anger, negotiating, all of those things before I went back to make it healthy. You know what I mean?
I do. I wonder, though, at the time, because I think I don't, for some reason, and it's true, but some reason I have a hard time relating everything we've talked about here is going through that grief cycle, but I totally know what you mean, because of some of the same steps that, when I lost my mother, and she was the most significant loss in my life at that point, there was times I was mad. There was times where I was pleading. There was times when I was, just sad. And then something would happen and would pull me back from one emotion to the next. And when you stop and think about it, that's exactly what was happening in this relationship. The weird thing is, and again, I don't want to dig up old scars or anything, but the weird thing is it almost felt like in certain relationships, and I'm going to focus in on the narcissistic relationship, that was a tool that was almost used against me, because they learned that there was certain places I would go and I wouldn't go. And I think once I was going through that grief process, they knew when to pull me back into the parts of the emotions that would keep me engaged, because all of this was about me moving me and my family. And this was about my wife moving, herself and the family out of that control, out of that circle that just kept going. And this person kept knowing which trigger to pull that would put us back in an emotional state where we would just keep re-engaging. And again, that's completely hindsight. And I don't know if that's, textbook or not, but that was something that after it was all said and done, you want to talk about, manipulation. What a way to do that is by keeping someone just in an emotional state that keeps them. It doesn't matter how the engagement was. It didn't even matter to what engagement they received from us. It was, I was getting engagement from you. And that was more important than the type of engagement. Just having the control to say, I'm keeping you engaged. That's enough for me.
I think that's well said. And it can be textbook. Yeah. I think, every given situation is somewhat different, but I think that manipulative piece and that dynamic, the way you describe the manipulation is right on in many, many situations. I think also the grief, it's not always what we're grieving and it's tangible and we see. It's what we believed was going to be. Like, I envisioned this for my grandkids with their grandma, or my kids with their grandma, that kind of a thing. And we grieve that. And a lot of times we do that process without even being aware of it. Like like I said, both of you, that lived experience is so valuable. You just can't minimize that. And again, having the language is super important, but sometimes just having phrases in conversations, even if we don't have technical language, can be so helpful. So I hope that there's a lot of identification with the listeners about that, because that's so profound. It's so important. It's invaluable as people go through this journey, to know you're not alone. Bringing that back around to some of the initial statements when the podcast started, is like, because we're not alone, and you're not alone. And the other thing is, like, no matter what I know, that's my logical brain. I still experience, if I'm going to have a loss and I'm like, okay, this X stressor is coming up, or this is happening, or this happened, I can say, okay, this is how I'm going to deal with it. This is what's going to happen. This is what I'm going to experience. But guess what? I have to go through it. That's part of our humanness, because regardless of our logical brain, of course, I could do substance use. I could find ways to avoid and escape. I could be a workaholic. I mean, not that we all haven't done some of those, right? But also then, if we hold ourselves accountable and we want to be the best version of ourselves, we can look back and say, okay, I'm going to go through this process. I'm going to fight it, or I'm not going to fight it. But I'm going to maybe be able to recognize what I am, or I'm just going to let myself be human, regardless of the information I have. As long as I'm not hurting someone else, hurting myself, it's okay. I kind of rambled a little bit there, but you get the drift. Like, we're human, and I want to avoid pain, but our humanness makes us go through it if we want to remain connectable, reachable, and in touch with our reality and with others.
One thing that you were saying there, Dr. Krista, that I just want to reflect on for a minute. I'm a big proponent. I've said this before. Jamie knows this about me, my professional and personal career. Sometimes you have to feel the pain in order for you to grow. For myself, what I find that easy to do, first of all, it's easier to give that advice to other people than it is to myself. That's one. Two, there's certain areas that are harder for me to apply that in. And when you're talking about emotional pain for me, that is one area. I can do it in all other aspects of my life, hands down. I won't even question it. You want me to do that when it starts involving my emotions or my emotional pain? that's an Achilles heel for me, and that's amplified. And when some of the best advice goes through, throw out the baby with the bathwater, because it's too difficult at sometimes, right? It's too much pain. And is it really worth it? Those are things that I struggle with when I have to talk around that emotional pain that you have to deal with. And I just thought that was a really interesting concept that you were just talking about. I just wanted to add that.
I want to throw this in real quick while you're in this space, Mahlon. Think about what you just said, and that's your Achilles heel. Take that exponent times some exponential number. That's the narcissistic wound of someone who has those personality characteristics. That twinge of reactivity that you have, that's what we're talking about. But that you take that, and they've lived that across the board in many areas. And again, not an excuse, but trying to get an inkling of understanding where they come from. Does that make sense?
It does. And I really don't want you to try to make this relatable to me to them, because it now makes me go, okay, I see it a little bit different, which is the whole point. I was kind of being
right.
funny, but it's the whole point, right? Like, it does make them a little bit more relatable, because if I can even pull back the curtain a little bit on something that's so bizarre to me and say, this is how I react, and if this is one fraction of what they're reacting, it does make me start seeing it in a different light. My knee-jerk reaction is, well, don't give them an excuse for their behavior. That's not what you said. That's not what you meant. But that's how I need to learn to take that information in and digest it, because that's 100% me. What you said wasn't excuse their behavior because of X, Y, and Z. I'm rambling now, but I just wanted to pull that point out, is that it's very, very useful, and it's 100% how I take that information and what I do with it. And it's hard. It's just hard.
Without a doubt. And that's why it was necessary for me to say it immediately after you, because you needed to be in the emotions of that still, because then it has meaning. And I love that you heard me say it doesn't excuse behavior, because that's, in my opinion, one of the things that even professionals do, is because we can see others' histories and we can see their side, it doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean it's okay, period. We can understand it. The other thing is, it's really helpful not hear that you had to change, or your boundaries have to change, or your behaviors have to change. It's just to understand it. It's not to change anything. It's not to change it. It's just to understand it from another perspective or differently. It doesn't have to lead to anything changing at all.
I think one thing that I'm curious about is, we've done, this is the 4th episode about this topic. And I do think that there's so many things that this topic really reaches into, right? Like, just about personal wellness and healthy relationships and toxic relationships and what to do with that. I mean, there's so many pieces to that. But I guess one thing I'm curious about, whenever I hear these kind of things, there are times where I hear something that kind of like, I don't know, like convicts me a bit, right? Like, wow, I remember a situation where I did really react like that. And, it gives me a moment to pause and think about that and reflect on that and work on, what would I do next time if that situation arose again? How would I handle that differently? So I guess my question for you is, if anybody is listening to this and they're feeling all kinds of things because this has brought up whatever it's brought up for them. If it's, I think I'm in a relationship that is this, that looks like this, or am I perpetrating in a relationship and causing harm to another person? If we've got people who are listening, what are some suggestions you would have about how to really respond to that and move forward in, I guess, working through these things in a healthy way?
I think a couple of key things. One is, if you're listening to this, there's probably a reason, and acknowledge that it's okay to grow from it. And it's going to do, quote unquote, no harm if you just do something. So like, because it's a recording, listen to it more than once. What really stands out as you listen to it the second time. So that everything isn't so overwhelming, because it'd be kind of like that physician med student phenomenon, like, oh, this fits. I have this disorder. You know, take that away by listening to it more than once. What really stands out? Choose those top 2 or 3 things, or items, or categorize them. This is bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3, in the things that are going on that I could relate to in this podcast. Take those top 2 and say, okay, I really want to. These are 3 circumstances in which this applies. What was my role in it? What was the other person's role in it? How did I respond? What was I feeling? What was I thinking? So if you can identify those things you relate to, and then put it in that little framework of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. What was the situation? What were my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and going on? What was my accountability in it? What was the other person's? Again, this is a lot. But this is what we do in therapy, especially cognitive behavior therapy, is just introspect that way, but write it out. So the other key pieces, that dynamic, listen to the podcast more than once, choose those top 2, identify them, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, what were the situations, my reactions, etc. And then process it in different ways. You've heard it, you're thinking about it, write it out. Write it out, type it out. So the more ways that we can include our sensory experiences, and we can grow and learn. So we're writing it, we're hearing it, we're maybe visualizing a certain scenario in our head that we've written down. I think all those would be really tangible ways to grow from the information from the podcast, and ways to approach it. Again, I go back to some things that Mahlon said too, is like, give yourself grace. We are all experiencing a human experience, and we're just growing. I mean, I learn from my students, I learn from my clients, I learn from my colleagues every single day of ways I do and don't want to be, in ways that I don't want to think, feel, or behave. And when we can look at ourselves and stop and think, and do some of those strategies I just listed, then take a break from it and give ourselves grace. It's important to not be there all the time. It's very important to take a dive, take a deep dive sometimes, maybe just a little dip sometimes, and trust yourself. But if that addresses what you were thinking in terms of some tangible strategies to look at it, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, incorporate more than one sensory experience. Oh, the one thing I didn't mention is, like, when you're looking at your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to those 2 or 3 things that you identify, where do you feel that in your body? And you can practice thinking about those situations, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, taking deep breaths, and release where that is in your body, because you'll be helping yourself physiologically as well.
That's some good insight. And I guess I was just thinking, and I was just kind of browsing as you were talking about that. There are a couple of episodes that we've done about these things, about some of these topics previously. One of them was episode 16 from July of 2023. Feel free to go back and look at that. That was, really about those circles of control and what we do with our thoughts and our feelings and actions. And we talked about radical acceptance there too. We also had an episode, didn't we have an episode about like emotional intelligence? I feel like emotional intelligence was a good episode too, that talked a lot about interacting with people and stuff like that too. That was episode 39 from January of 2024. So those are just a couple episodes you can go back where we have kind of covered some of these.
And the dark triad, remember that?
I was going to say, I forgot about that. Mahlon always loves to look at the dark side of these things too. So episode 41 was the EQ shadow, when emotional intelligence turns manipulative. So those are just a few episodes where we have covered some of these topics, but I feel like this was such a good space to come together and bring some of those things together and talk about, some real life examples about how this affects us as people. So just wanted to offer those resources. Do you have any other resources, Dr. Krista, that you can share? Like, is there a book that would be really good if you're kind of going through this, or something that our listeners might benefit from?
Definitely. I'm very cautious on promoting some self-help books, because some are beneficial, some aren't.
Right.
One thing that I think can be very helpful is understanding mood regulation and dysregulation. So materials related to dialectic behavior therapy, DBT, and especially establishing understanding of how we can regulate our emotions and how we can become dysregulated is sometimes I think helpful because it ties to maybe some of the reactivity of people who have some of the toxic characteristics that we've talked about. It may present itself in words, behaviors, but oftentimes it's a sense of lashing out that may be related to mood dysregulation and self-protection. So I think anything DBT, and there's some good apps, even if you've not like done therapy or counseling, DBT, dialectic behavior therapy app, and it just gives you strategies of ways to like document your mood and experiences and strategies of then how to kind of regulate some of those things. Also, any mindfulness practices will give you some skills along these lines. Specific to narcissism, honestly, I really hesitate to give out information because it's so much can be misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm.
And so the biggest thing I would encourage is people to check out the resources. If there is opportunity to look at the people that are talking in, say, podcasts or the author, check it out before you use that resource. And I know not everyone is well-versed in finding information, but I think that's really helpful to do is just check out the authors, check out particular individuals and situations, podcasts, etc. Other key information or maybe resources for narcissism are some of the experts that are using these modalities like DBT. So Marsha Lineman, some of the experts in treatment of personality disorders. And then we're getting to some like more formal types of information or resources. But I think just check out your resources before you would definitely partake in it. Or afterward, do it in a joint group. Find resources and have a book study with one or two people that are safe, that kind of a thing. And I know I kind of talked around specifics, other than like DBT is pretty very, very much helpful. But I feel concerned because I don't want to like promote something when it can be interpreted however somebody wants to interpret it.
Well, I think it goes without saying too. I would assume that consulting with a therapist would be helpful if that's a space where you're struggling in a relationship with someone that you believe is narcissistic or toxic or has a personality disorder, or heck, if any of these episodes made someone who maybe has some of these struggles in your relationships. And, I think that that's a great place to start. A therapist is always a good place to start. I know that they will refer you on to where you need to be if that's not the right spot for you. So,
yeah. And similarly with that, check out resources. Go to, if you're considering seeing someone and it's not a word of mouth by somebody that you trust and know, I would see if there's any ratings on that therapist. See if there is anybody that knows about that therapist. Make sure they're licensed. Make sure they're credible, because there's different levels of experience with therapists, as well as like any profession, there's more helpful and less helpful professionals in that area too. So be cautious. This is your life, and it's really important. Would it be okay if I throw out one other thing? And I know we're winding down a little bit, but related to this notion of toxic relationships and possible resource is a self-help book that I use in my classes a lot, and it definitely is helpful if you do it like in a group context, is related to attachment, because our attachment styles that begin when we're very, very young. There's probably even a genetic component to that. And there's some predispositions, but of course our exposures from very young impact how we can relate to others and our willingness to trust and be close to others, right? But there is one book just called called Attached that I use in my classes, and I always say I'm going to veer away from it, but my students just love it, and we create, yeah, it's just called Attached. And again, there's no conflict of interest with this, no kickbacks, but Levine and Heller are the authors. And it just gives some insight as to our attachment styles. One caveat to that my students gradually, as they get through the book, recognize is like, there's not like these strong, strict categories. You are securely attached, or you're avoidantly attached, or you're anxious attachment. It's really a fluid thing, depending on what the context of the relationship is, what else situational factors are going on in your life. And it is fluid. It does change and shift throughout our lifetimes if we stay open to growing. That's where like personality characteristics can get stuck. But that is a really one of many ways that we can, I think it's a good read because it helps us to introspect. It gives us some scales. It's very much on the level where most anybody can read it and understand it. Yet at the same time, it does cite some research to support it. It's not the end all be all. You can see my hesitancy to ever recommend anything, but it is really powerful, and it's doable, and it just gives us a foundation to kind of do some exploration that may impact our relationships primarily.
I guess what I'm hearing is that these are not substitutes for help from a good professional if that's necessary. But I do think that in my life, I can see how different reads, different podcasts, different things have just kind of even just brought it onto the radar so that I know that it's something that I should look at, that it's something that may be something I should address. There's another book, I guess, and I don't know if you've read it. It's pretty new. I just recently picked this one up. It's called The Let Them Theory by Mel Robinson. And that has been super helpful in me in setting boundaries. Like, I think I've really, I feel like I've gotten pretty practiced at it. And it's just been a really good, a good example of why it's important and how to set boundaries in a healthy way. So if that is something that you're interested in, I would totally recommend that. And I would also recommend the help of a professional if you need it. So both exist for me, but yeah.
Agreed. And I have heard great reviews on that book. I've not read it myself at this point. Codependent No More. I'll just throw that out there. That's a really good book as you're exploring relationships in general, not necessarily specific to narcissism, but your dynamics and what relationships dynamics are going on. And again, that's an older book that I don't think newer is always better. And so that's an older one that I think is a really good place to start to introspect and to explore some of these dynamics and help us to take accountability in those relationships, not always point the finger either. Because as Mahlon has very well said, we have responsibility on all ends and spectrum, same as Jamie has said. So,
yeah.
Well, we'll make sure in our show notes that we have a list of those. We are not, I'm just going to say this now, we do not get any kickbacks. We don't get any money. So Jamie and I get nothing. But we're going to put a link out there. Yeah, we're just going to put a link out there. It may be to Amazon, so it may look like it's to purchase it. Again, I'm just trying to share some sort of information. But we'll put, if not a link, then we'll at least keep the name of the books in the show notes. So if you want to go back and look at those, you can.
Before we go too far, though, I would also highly endorse the idea of listening to these podcasts more than once, which is why I gave you some extra episodes. Please go listen again.
I wasn't going to say it, but those will also be in the show notes. But I didn't want to be like, oh, Dr. Krista can't recommend it, but we can. And it's episode 16 and 32. And that's everything you need to know. No, I'm just kidding. But no, we'll have those in there as well. Again, the name of the game for all of this has just been, we said it at the very beginning. I'm just going to say it now as we're kind of shutting the book on narcissists. I can't say we won't ever reopen it. I come back later times, who knows? But again, we're not here to diagnose. The whole point of this whole conversation and having Dr. Krista on here isn't to make sure people know certain people in our lives are or aren't a narcissist. It's just having the conversation because there are elements here that people need to, be made aware of, or maybe they're becoming aware of, doesn't mean you can just slap a label on them and say, oh, they're a narcissist, I know how to handle it. It's just to be aware that these types of behaviors are happening. Here's how destructive they are. Here's one example of where this went down the path in my life. If it helps anybody else to recognize any element of it in theirs, I hope it does. And I hope for the majority of our listeners, if not all of them, that you can't relate to the stories in the conversation that we had, because you're not exposed to it. But in the event that there are elements, I hope it helps you, and I hope you can, get some peace of mind and some help if you need it, because that's really why we wanted to do this mini series on narcissist. And Dr. Krista, again, to say thank you just seems hollow at this point. I don't ever want to say goodbye to you, because I'm already thinking of another episode I want to bring you on to. So you might be stuck with us now, but thank you for coming on and just sharing your wisdom and your education and your experience and all of it, because it really does help. And even this little bit where I was stuck in that little emotional switch and you had to ask me that question, I wasn't ready for it, but it's good. So again, thank you so much. We just appreciate you all around.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, because your mission is mine. I want to advocate for people's wellness across the board. And when we can all come together and share our real world, and sometimes, being a friend with information, when people call me, it's like, I'm just a friend. It's outside of the professional realm. I'm a friend that has information, and don't have the answers or all the answers. But in our conversations, we can jointly come up with what fits for varying individuals, because we're not cookie cutters, right? We all have our own twists and turns, and I think it's really important that we keep the word out, but also recognize that when we talk about mental health, it's not just this phrase that's thrown out. We do want to decrease stigma. We do want to keep conversations going, and if we can do that, then we can take away the scariness, but we can also not make it too pathological, not go to the other end of the spectrum where we're not talking about it at all, to everything is mental health, or is about negative mental health or pathology. That mental health can be a very positive thing, and these things that we've talked about in moderation are part of everyone's human experience. And so thank you for letting me be part of this conversation, and I'd gladly come back and talk about anything that I might be helpful with, or if there's anything you can help me grow in.
No, we appreciate it. We appreciate it a lot. You've been an excellent resource for us in this conversation, and I'm positive I'm sure we've got some conversations coming that we could use your your help with. So we appreciate the openness to come back. So I just want to thank all of you for being along with this ride. It was it's been a good chunk of episodes. I'm glad we finally went here, Mahlon. It took us a while to get here, but I'm glad we did. So we hope you've enjoyed, and we hope you come back again in a couple weeks for our next episode of Roundtable Mindset. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.